there was a need for a new door at the White House, and so they brought in a few carpenters to bid on a job, and 3 men came to the White House, and the guide that was taking them around took them to the place where they needed this door framed and showed them the job and talked about it a little bit and had them all sit down to write up a bid. And 2 of them were writing, and the other guy was just sitting there kind of looking around, pondering in his head, and they got all done, and the guy looked at the first carpenter and said, well, what'd you come up with? And he said, well, I came up with $400 in materials and $400 in labor, and we'll need about $100 profit, so I'll say $900. And he looked at the second guy, and he said, well, mine was close, but I thought we could do it for $350 labor and $350 in material and $100 profit, so I was bidding $800. And he looked at the third guy, and the third guy said $2,800. And the guy looked at him, he said, well, that's a pretty high bid compared to the others, and you didn't even do any figuring. And the guy said, oh, I did the figuring. Here's how it works. $1,000 for me, $1,000 for you, and we'll pay $700 to the other guy to do it. So that seems to be the state of politics in our world today, doesn't it? Will Rogers, 2 generations ago, said, people are getting confused. They're beginning to treat their politicians like comedians and take their comedians seriously. And that little comment is something that certainly could apply to today's world in our country. It's already been a wild year in politics, hasn't it? And it's going to be more so over the next 7 weeks. It's going to get worse. I think both parties want to gain control of both houses and the presidency. And to be honest, if either party gets that, it scares me because they seem to be at such extremes at this point in time. But that's what they want to happen, and some people are willing to go to any length to see that happen. And you know what God does? You know what God does with that? He laughs. He laughs. That may be a surprise to some of you, but God sits in the heavens and laughs at both sides. At both sides, because he knows who's really in control. And so we want to take and look at a psalm that talks about that today. As we head into a fall that's going to be a crazy season with elections and some major decisions being made in that regard, we're going to start a fall series next week called The Religion of Jesus and the Religion of Man. And we're looking at a few chapters in the book of Matthew where Jesus compared human thinking to true religion. And so we're going to be looking at that between now and Thanksgiving. But just to kick off this fall, I wanted to take a look at Psalm chapter 2. And so I would encourage you to turn there and follow along with this with me through this. It's been known for centuries as the coronation psalm because God says, I have installed my king. So a coronation psalm. Now, we don't know that it was ever used for a coronation of a king at any time, but that's what it's been called for a long time. But because of our political process in this country, because of the climate of our nation, we're going to change that coronation psalm to the election psalm. And we're going to read it this fall as the election psalm because I think it has a lot to teach us about that. But before we get into it, I want to point out some trivia about this psalm. So a little bit of trivia tidbits, if you will. I had read this is the most quoted psalm in the New Testament. I didn't think that was right. I looked it up. It's not. It is the 3rd most quoted psalm in the New Testament. So it's very often quoted in the New Testament. If you don't know it, the book of Psalms is the most quoted book in the New Testament, most quoted Old Testament book in the New Testament. It's the book of Psalms. Some of you might have thought it was Isaiah. It's actually the book of Psalms. And this chapter is the 3rd most quoted of all the Psalms. Now, chapter 110 is the most quoted. Chapter 69 is next, and then the 2nd Psalm. And that's not just trivia, though, because that teaches us or gives us a glimpse of how the New Testament authors viewed parts of the Old Testament and why they saw this as such an important psalm. And we'll see that as we go through it. The second bit of trivia I want to tell you about is this is the only Old Testament passage that's quoted in the New Testament and given a number. Nowhere else does it have a number, but in Acts 13, Paul calls this the second psalm. The second psalm. So there's a little bit of trivia for you. The only Old Testament passage that's given a number in the New Testament. And that's not just trivia either, because I think that's just another little piece of evidence that says these prophecies about Jesus were written centuries before him. Because by the time Paul came along, the Jewish canon had been settled. They knew what their scripture was, and Paul was able to quote the second psalm. And it's a psalm that prophesies about Jesus. And this is just another piece of evidence that shows those prophecies were written centuries before Jesus ever came along. So a little bit of trivia. But let's get into the psalm itself, the coronation or the election psalm. It easily divides into 4 sections, and each section has 3 verses. So it outlines very easy. You'll probably see the paragraph breaks in your Bible if you look at that, if your Bible has those. And so we're just going to go through one section at a time and see what it has to say. So beginning with the first 3 verses, this talks about the kings of the earth. The kings of the earth. Here's what it says. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. It says, why do the nations rage? Or some translations say conspire. It's an interesting word. It means to snort. It's expressing contempt by exhaling. Or God's in control. Ha! God's not in control, I am. You get the idea that's behind this. It's a snort, a fast exhaling that shows contempt, if you will. Ha! The picture I get in my mind is a cartoon bull ready to charge. And you see those nostrils snorting. And that's exactly what is happening in this word. This is what the kings of the nations are doing. They are ready to charge. They are ready to attack. They are conspiring. In fact, later it says they're plotting. They're plotting in vain against the Lord. Plot is another interesting word. In fact, it's the same root word. If you look up just a little before that in chapter 1, verse 2, it says, blessed is the man whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. The word plot here is the same root word as the word meditate in that passage. It's the same root word as meditate that you see all the way through Psalm 119 in numerous cases. Now you think that's kind of an interesting connection. How does that work? Well, it's meditating, plotting is putting your mental energy towards something. And if we're plotting, we're putting our mental energy against God's word. But we can put our mental energy into delighting in God's word, as it says in Psalm 1. So this is all about where do we put our mental energy. And these leaders of the nations are against God in their mental energy. Not only against God, but against God and his anointed. Against God and his anointed. We'll come back to that in a minute, but that's important to see. So all these rulers are conspiring, they're raging, they're making their plot, and they're taking a stand together against God. And here's what they say when they take that stand. Let us break their bonds. Let us burst their bonds apart, cast away their cords from us. Some of your translations will say chains. Let us burst their chains. This is what the kings are saying about God and his anointed. Let's burst God's chains. You see, they think a relationship with God is something that is binding. It's like being in prison chains. If we have a relationship with God, we are chained by his laws. We're completely bound by them. And that's probably how some of you feel when you read God's laws. But I think you have the wrong perspective about that. The world is full of politicians. The world is full of kings. The world is full of people trying to break what they perceive as bonds, God's laws. In fact, if you look at Psalm 58, we're going to use it for our prayer a little bit later. It talks about gods, but it's really addressing the rulers of the world. It says, "Do you indeed decree what is right, you gods? Do you judge the children of man uprightly? No, in your hearts you devise wrong. Your hands deal out violence." You see, we're planning evil. We're planning on breaking those chains that God has put us in. But you know what? God's rules are not prison fences. They're not chains. God's rules are fences, but here's the way to think of them. They are zoo fences, not prison fences. What do zoo fences do? They give you the freedom to enjoy God's creation. That's what they do without being harmed. And that's exactly what God's laws are. They are zoo fences. They protect you from harm, but give you the freedom to enjoy God's creation. That's the kind of fences that God's laws are. They aren't prison fences. If that's been your perspective on things, you need to change that. Kings and politicians don't want those laws because they believe they bind them up, and so they look to change those laws any way they can. City Council was interviewing a candidate for city manager, and they were asking him the general questions about his background and his leadership philosophy and so on. And finally, one of the councilmen just looked at him. He said, "What's 2 plus 2? And the candidate looked around the table, and he thought a minute, and he walked over and he pulled the shades on the window of the conference room, and he opened the door and looked outside both ways, and he shut the door and he locked it, and he sat down and he said, 'What do you want it to be?' They probably hired him on the spot. Yeah, that's the way politics works. We want to change the given laws of the universe because we see them as binding. But God's laws are truly freeing so that we can enjoy His creation. They conspire and plot against the Lord. The second section of this psalm is God's response to those kings. That would be verses 4 through 6. "He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, 'As for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill.'" God's response, He laughs. Now, was that a surprise to some of you, possibly, that God is one who laughs? As you study this word, the word experts will tell you this is the victor's chuckle. You know how someone who, once he knows he has victory, sometimes will look at the opponent and kind of, that's the kind of laugh this is. God looks at those kings who are conspiring against him and just kind of chuckles. They don't have a clue who's in charge, but God is already the victor. That idea of God laughing isn't just in this passage alone. It's in some other places. For instance, Psalm 37 verse 12 said, "The wicked plots against the righteous and gnashes his teeth at him. But the Lord laughs at the wicked, for he sees his day is coming." Psalm chapter 59, verses 7 and 8 is talking again about the nations rousing themselves against God. And verse 7 says, there they are, bellowing with their mouths and with their swords in their lips, for who they think will hear us. But you, O Lord, laugh at them. You hold the nations in derision. Almost a very word-for-word passage to the verse in Psalm chapter 2. He laughs. That's how God deals with these rulers who are trying to break his bonds and free themselves from him. He also rebukes them in his wrath. He not only laughs, it says he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury. It proves that he's the one that's in control. But he also then tells of his true king that he has established. Verse 6, he says, "As for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill." It's not the human kings that really matter. It's not kings who inherit the job. It's not kings who are appointed to the job. It's not even kings who are elected to the job. It's the king that God appoints. That is the true king. And that's what God is saying. He has a true king. Now, this passage at this point has what I would call an immediate or local application. And this is how many of the Old Testament Jews would have understood this passage, just in this way, that the anointed king is David, because God anointed him to be the true king. And during the time of David and his son Solomon, Israel was the most powerful nation in the world. The Hittite Empire was disappearing. The Egyptian Empire was in weakness. The old Babylonian Empire was gone, and the new Assyrian Empire had not really established itself yet. And Israel wasn't big, but it was the most powerful nation in the world at that time. And so the rulers of the nations could easily refer to the nations around Israel who wanted to be free from Israel's rule over them. And that's how many of the Old Testament people would have viewed that. The anointed king is David, and of course David's descendants after him, and those nations around them are the ones who plot and rage to break the bonds of Israel. But that's not the end of the psalm. And it goes well beyond that. So look at the next section, which talks about the decree of the Lord. Verses 7 through 9. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them to pieces like a pottery vessel. This section is the decree of the Lord. It's what God says to his anointed king. What God says to his anointed king. The first thing he says to his anointed king is, you are my son. You are my son. Isn't that a fascinating statement? The king that God has anointed has a very strong relationship with God, so much so that God would call him his son. And he says to him, the nations will be your inheritance. This son who's appointed king is just not some sort of small local king, not even a king of a powerful nation like Israel. This is the king who is the king of all the world. That's the king that we're talking about here. A king who will put an end to all the other nations that rebel against God. Not just nations around Israel, but all the nations. So the immediate application may be to David. But these promises go way beyond the kingdom of David and Solomon and his descendants. And so there's a much more broad application, or what I might call a universal application. And this is how the New Testament authors understood this passage. And this is how they applied it when they quoted it. The broader application is this: the rulers of all ages plot against the Lord. The rulers of all the ages, not just those around Israel, but all ages, all times, all over the world. One commentator said, this chapter's a brief history of the world. All nations rebel against God. But you know what God does? He laughs. He laughs at them because he has anointed his true king. And we know who that true king is. It's Jesus. That is the true king. You see, Jesus is the one who is called God's Son forever. Jesus is the one who is the Son of the Most High. It's Jesus whose kingdom will never end. It's the nations that he's the one that inherits the nations. It says even to the ends of the world. In fact, of his kingdom there will never be an end to the increase of his kingdom. And so ultimately the application of this is not to David, it is to Jesus. It's interesting that I read a blog that was just written this week on crossway.org that addresses exactly this issue. And so this is just written this past week by Hunter Baker. He is an associate professor of political science at the Union University in Jackson, Tennessee. So this is a political science professor. The title of the article is, What Did Jesus Teach Us About Politics? What did Jesus teach us about politics? Listen to what he says. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It was lengthy, but I've picked out the key thoughts, and so listen to this. When I consider the question of where the teaching of Jesus fits into our current politics, I realize that readers are likely to begin thinking right away about questions such as abortion, immigration, racism, social justice. But rather than work my way through a list of current issues and to suggest which choices would have the approval of Jesus, which in most cases would be presumptuous based on my own sin nature, my biases, and my limitations, I would like to take note of two major points that I see shining through the Scriptures. The first point has to do with how we view government. It seems to me that what Jesus says in this passage is the passage about give to God what is God's and give to Caesar what is Caesar's. That's the passage he makes reference to. It seems to me that what Jesus says in this passage is that there is a place for the government. It has a rightful task. It has a duty it should fulfill. But even bringing God into consideration introduces a new dimension. The idea and reality of a Caesar is a grand and mighty thing. But as soon as we place God next to this earthly ruler, Caesar's stature is immediately and radically put into perspective. Yeah, we have great kings, but when we put them up to God, suddenly we have a better perspective about what they're really like. Caesar will be like all the others. Earthly kings will crumble and their statues will erode. Their real significance is that they reflect, oftentimes badly, God's greater rule. There is a rightful zone and activity that belongs to the government, but it's not extensive with the whole that is ruled by God. The government should and never be confused with the authority beyond all authorities. Okay, first point, government has a place. But the second point is that Jesus declares his kingship. Jesus declares his kingship. He will sit on a glorious throne, not as some local chieftain presiding over a tribe or even as a great emperor over many lands, but as the king over all the nations with their people gathered before him. But we must remember not to think merely of Jesus as a friend or a brother. Make no mistake about it. He is a king. He's not only a king, he is the one true king. The political impact of that reality is as much as we become excited over presidents like Donald Trump or Barack Obama or George Bush or Bill Clinton or Ronald Reagan, we should be far more attentive to the reality of the kingship of Jesus Christ. Isn't that a great statement? Government has its place, but governments will crumble. The true king is Jesus, and that's exactly what Psalm chapter 2 tells us. There's what the kings declare against God. There's God's response of laughing at that and setting up his true king. And then there is the decree of God, you are my son. And the application of that is realizing the true king is Jesus. Here's the fourth section, the last part. It's the conclusion and warnings. It is the warnings to these kings. As we read it, realize that's what it is. These kings are being warned. Verse 10, now therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. Here's the warnings for the king. Number one, wise up. Wise up. It's a sharp rebuke. You know what it sounds like to me? It sounds like a parent saying to a teen, use your head. How often did you hear that as a teenager? How often have you said that to your teenagers? Use your head. It's like God says to the politicians, use your head, stupid. A guy needed a brain transplant, and he went to the neurosurgeon that was going to do it, and the guy said, well, there's 4 brains available. One belonged to a nuclear scientist. That'll cost you $400,000. And the other one, the next one, belonged to a college professor. That'll cost you $300,000. The other one belonged to a construction worker. That'll cost you $100,000. And the guy said, I thought you said there were 4 available. He said, yeah, the other one belonged to a Washington bureaucrat. It'll cost you $4 million. And the guy looked at him and said, what? Why would a bureaucrat's brain cost $4 million? And the doctor said, well, duh, it's never been used. Use your head. Wise up, rulers of the world. Look at what's going on. Look who's really in control. Second warning, serve the Lord. Serve the Lord. Come to him because he rules over you, and then act like it. Come to him because he rules over you and act like it. Even it says with fear and trembling. That's that recognition that we're not in control. God is. And then a very interesting expression, kiss the Son. Kiss the Son. That's kind of an odd thing to say to these rulers, isn't it? A kiss in some cultures was a public acknowledgement of authority. A public acknowledgement of authority. Now step back and think about that for a minute. Because what did Judas do when he betrayed Jesus? He betrayed him with a kiss. And not only was he saying to those Roman authorities, this is the guy to arrest, but he was using a sign of authority. He was ironically saying to Jesus, you're the one who's in authority. At the same time, he was telling the Roman authorities, this is the guy to arrest because you are the real authority. Do you see the irony in that? That's kind of interesting. But anyway, this idea of a kiss in some cultures is an acknowledgement of authority. And so what God is saying is acknowledge or pay homage to the one to whom it's really due, to this Son who has been established as kings. There are a lot of rulers and politicians who pay homage to Jesus, but it's not real. Think about that. How many politicians from every perspective and every political belief call themselves Christians? And they often do that, I think, because it puts them in a place where they're liable to get more votes. But politicians from every side call themselves Christian. They pay homage, but it's not true. And a kiss means a true homage, genuine homage. So wise up, serve the Lord, kiss the Son, and then the last one is take refuge in him. Now, that's not a command. It's actually a promise that the ones who take refuge in him will be blessed, but there is a command hinted at that. You know something? That's really hard for leaders to do. To take refuge in someone else implies I have a need. And it is very hard for leaders, and I think maybe more so for political leaders than anything else, to say, I have a need. Because what do they do to get elected? They're constantly promising they have it all figured out. They're going to help you meet all your needs. And so it's very hard for people in leadership to take refuge. It says, I have a need. But God says, take refuge in the Son, because if you don't, he will come and destroy you. He is coming to destroy those nations. You know what? This has a lot more application than just to kings and rulers, because it applies to us too, even if we aren't in those positions. It applies to us because we must pay homage to Jesus and serve him. If he rules over all of those kings and nations and politicians, certainly he rules over us too. And so our command is to pay genuine homage to him and to serve him. Again, there are a lot of people around the world that claim homage to Jesus, but it's not genuine. If it really is, their lives will demonstrate it. But so many people pay homage to Jesus because it's a way to get what they want. It's a way to get what they want. Think about this story in the New Testament. Jesus had been teaching, and there were thousands of people gathered around him. It was getting late. They didn't have anything to eat. And Jesus told his disciples to feed the crowd. And they're like, we don't have anything to feed the crowd with. You want us to go spend a bunch of money? And they brought to Jesus a lunch of a little boy that had 5 little barley rolls and 2 dried fish. And Jesus had the people sit down, and he broke those rolls and broke those fish and began passing it out. And the entire crowd ate, and they picked up all kinds of leftovers. Now, you know that story. But here's what happened next. Jesus left that area and went to get alone with his disciples, and that entire crowd followed him. And Jesus says, well, what happened? Why did you follow me? And this is what the text says in John 6, 26 and 27. This is the Glenn paraphrase. He says, you didn't come because of what I did and you know who I am. You came to follow me because I gave you a free lunch. Think about that for a minute. All these thousands of people were following Jesus not because he proved who he was with an act of creation, but because they got a free lunch out of it. And there are a lot of people in the world that pay homage to Jesus today because they think they might get something out of it. But we pay homage to Jesus because he is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Well, that's Psalm 2. But I don't want to stop there, because I think it has some even more specific applications for where we are as a nation right now this fall, because this is an election year, and we called this an election psalm. And 2020 has been a weird year, and it's probably going to be a weird election too. So we have no idea what to anticipate there. Here's a couple applications. First of all, remember that new rulers are being chosen in our country real soon. New rulers are being chosen real soon. We as Christian people must pray about that. We must pray that God's will be done, and I believe we must vote. I think we must show up at the polls and vote. There are Christians who say, I'm not going to vote, there's no good candidates. You know what? They're right. There are no good candidates. You look at our choice for president, we can elect a big-mouthed jerk who's a womanizer, or we can vote for a guy who's been pushed around by his party and doesn't know what he believes and is a womanizer. That's your choice. There is no good choice. And people talk about the lesser of two evils, but you know what? Every single election you've ever seen is a lesser of two evils vote. Until Jesus Christ runs for president, there is not a perfect candidate. No matter where you are politically, there just isn't a thing, because they're all sinful. They're all going to try to break God's rules. Everyone running is a sinful candidate. There's not one candidate who's going to be for you as a Christian and for everything you believe in politically. There isn't going to be one. Just settle for that. But you know what? This is what Tim Keller said a couple weeks ago. You don't have to vote for the guy that's completely for you, but at least show up and don't vote for the guy that's against you. And I think that's where we are as Christians. And if you look at the platforms of the two parties that we have in our nation right now, one of those is clearly unchristian and one is not. And I can't say any more without getting in trouble. But it's pretty clear at this point in time where those parties are. We as Christians picking new rulers must realize they're all sinful, but we must pray and we must vote. I think also we need to realize something I've already said, but every candidate will try in some way to break God's chains, God's rules. Every candidate will. Even those who are believers do to some degree. We break God's rules in the definition of marriage, in changing of sexual norms, in other morality. We break God's rules by abusing the Social Security system and other money systems in our country. They break God's rules by denying justice to minorities. They break God's rules by applying the power of executive order too freely. They break God's rules by closing down businesses and churches. And all that's going on in our country from both sides of the political aisle. Every single one of these elected candidates will at some point try to break God's chains, but they are not the king. And that's the good news, because we serve the true king, and his name is Jesus, and he will reign, and we pay homage to him, regardless of what happens on the political perspective. We realize that we know and serve the true